You can replace shingles, repaint walls, even rebuild an entire house. But once trust is torn off a neighborhood, no contractor can nail it back down. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as freezing rain dripped straight through the open rafters and splashed onto the hardwood floor my father had installed with his own hands almost 20 years earlier. I stood barefoot in my living room just before sunrise, staring at a patch of gray sky where my roof had been the night before. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with wet insulation and damp drywall filled the air, while scraps of synthetic underlayment fluttered across my yard like someone had celebrated a victory I never agreed to. Across the street, 3 members of the HOA board stood beside a white pickup truck, coffee cups in hand, watching my house with the kind of satisfied smiles people wear when they believe they've already won. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 43 years old, a licensed structural engineer, and I've spent my entire career calculating exactly how much weight a roof can carry before it fails. Ironically, the one roof I never expected to lose was my own. The house belonged to my parents long before it belonged to me. Every cedar beam, every brick, every inch of that property carried memories that couldn't be measured in dollars. My father used to joke that a house wasn't valuable because of the market. It was valuable because of the people who came home to it. Standing there beneath exposed rafters, I realized someone had decided memories could be invoiced. The certified envelope taped to my front door flapped in the wind. I peeled it away carefully, my fingertips already numb from the cold rain. The letter was printed on expensive stationery with the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo embossed across the top. It informed me that my home had allegedly suffered extensive structural deficiencies requiring immediate compliance with an emergency community preservation assessment totaling $238,000. Failure to accept the assessment package, it warned, could result in liens, litigation, and eventual foreclosure proceedings under the association's governing documents. My eyes moved from the paper back to my missing roof. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategy. A county inspector's SUV rolled slowly past my driveway, paused for barely 3 seconds, then continued down the street without stopping. That struck me as odd because inspectors don't usually ignore houses with half their roofs missing. The contractor's trailer parked beside the curb carried no company logo, no state license number, nothing except fresh mud on the tires and a magnetic sign that had clearly been removed minutes earlier. Tiny details like that tend to stick in my mind. Engineers notice patterns. We notice measurements that don't match. We notice bolts tighten the wrong direction and beams cut an inch too short. We especially notice when damage looks less like a storm and more like a schedule. Diane Holloway, the HOA president, finally walked across my lawn holding a bright blue umbrella that somehow kept every drop of rain away from her designer coat. Her perfume drifted through the damp morning air before she even spoke. "Terrible weather," she said, glancing upward with theatrical sympathy. "These things happen." Fortunately, the board already approved a solution. She handed me another folder without waiting for an answer. "Sign today, Ethan, and our preferred contractor can start immediately. Delay much longer and your insurance company may refuse coverage." I looked at the paperwork, then at the clean edges where sections of my roof had disappeared with almost mathematical precision. The cuts were too straight. The exposed decking was too uniform. Even the scattered nails were lying where gravity alone couldn't have left them. Diane kept smiling, convinced she was watching another homeowner surrender. She had no idea the smallest detail on that roof would eventually cost every single board member the one thing they believed could never be taken away from them: their own homes. 8 months earlier, before the rain, before the missing roof, before Diane Holloway started speaking to me like she already owned my future, life inside Willow Creek Estates had been surprisingly quiet. I bought the house because it reminded me of the one where I grew up, modest, practical, and built to last. After 15 years designing commercial buildings across Texas, I wanted a place where I could hear birds instead of traffic and spend weekends restoring old woodworking tools that had belonged to my father. My neighbors waved when I moved in. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. The community looked exactly like the brochure promised. It took less than 3 months for me to realize appearances were carrying far more weight than honesty. The first notice arrived because my mailbox was supposedly painted the wrong shade of black. The second claimed my work trailer had remained in my driveway 27 minutes beyond the approved time limit after unloading equipment for a charity renovation project. Then came warnings about landscaping, outdoor lighting, and even the angle of my recycling bin on collection day. Individually, they sounded ridiculous. Together, they formed a pattern. Every conversation ended the same way. Diane would smile politely, adjust the folder tucked beneath her arm, and remind me that rules protected property values. I always complied when the requests were reasonable because I respected communities that enforce standards fairly. What I refused to support was the board's newest proposal. During the annual meeting, they unveiled plans for an extravagant clubhouse expansion, decorative entrance fountains, imported stone monuments, and luxury outdoor entertainment areas that would cost millions of dollars. The funding would come from a massive emergency assessment divided among homeowners. Mine alone would exceed $238,000. The room fell silent after the presentation. I glanced around and noticed something unsettling. Several board members avoided eye contact while others stared at the spreadsheets without turning a single page. The financial projections contained impossible assumptions, construction estimates with no competitive bids, and maintenance costs that somehow became smaller after adding expensive amenities. Years of reviewing engineering contracts had taught me one simple lesson. When numbers stop making sense, someone expects nobody to read them carefully. I raised my hand and asked whether homeowners could review the vendor contracts before voting. Diane's smile tightened just enough for me to notice. She replied that sensitive business information could not be distributed until after approval. I asked whether independent estimates had been obtained. She redirected the discussion. I asked why one contractor appeared repeatedly throughout every proposed project despite offering prices significantly above regional averages. This time, several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The meeting ended earlier than scheduled, and my questions never received direct answers. The following morning, I found another violation notice attached to my front door. Then another arrived 3 days later. Soon, every ordinary aspect of homeownership seemed to generate a new complaint. Friends suggested I simply pay the assessment and move on. They said peace was worth the money. But engineers spend their careers solving problems by asking why something failed before deciding how to repair it. The more pressure the board applied, the less interested I became in signing their paperwork, and the more interested I became in understanding why they were suddenly so determined to make one homeowner disappear from the conversation. The pressure intensified almost immediately after I questioned the numbers. Every Monday morning, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox as predictably as the sunrise. The paper always smelled faintly of fresh printer toner, and every letter carried the same polished language about preserving community standards. Yet every notice targeted something different. One week it was an allegedly unauthorized exterior light bulb. The next week it was a complaint that my front walkway contained minor surface discoloration that supposedly diminished neighborhood appearance. Then it became my rain gutters, followed by my fence, followed by landscaping that had somehow become unacceptable despite looking exactly the same as it had on the day I purchased the property. Individually, every accusation seemed small enough to ignore. Together, they became exhausting. I began keeping every letter in a filing cabinet instead of throwing them away. Years of reviewing construction disputes had taught me that paperwork often reveals intentions long before people admit them out loud. Diane Holloway never raised her voice. She did not have to. She had mastered the art of sounding helpful while delivering threats wrapped in polite language. Every conversation ended with another reminder that homeowners who cooperated enjoyed smoother experiences with the association. The implication was impossible to miss. Sign the assessment package, stop asking questions, and the violations would probably disappear. Refuse, and the list would continue growing until the legal costs alone became overwhelming. Some of my neighbors quietly stopped talking whenever I walked past. A few who had once waved every evening suddenly looked down at their phones instead. Others offered sympathetic smiles, but quickly changed the subject whenever the board came up. One elderly couple finally admitted they had already paid the assessment even though they could barely afford it because they feared losing their retirement home. That conversation stayed with me. It was not just about expensive improvements anymore. Fear had become another monthly fee. A week later, I requested copies of the association financial records permitted under state law. The management office acknowledged my request, then informed me that processing would require additional review because several documents contained confidential vendor information. Days turned into weeks without receiving anything useful. Instead, another violation notice arrived claiming water stains had appeared along sections of my roof after a recent storm. That accusation immediately caught my attention because I inspect my own property regularly. I climbed into the attic that afternoon with a flashlight, expecting to find signs of moisture. The insulation remained perfectly dry. The rafters showed no discoloration. Even the roof decking looked solid. I made notes anyway, took photographs from every angle, and stored everything with the growing stack of HOA correspondence. Something did not fit. Either the violation had been fabricated, or someone expected future damage that had not happened yet. Engineers learn to respect inconsistencies because they usually point toward the real problem. As I stepped back into my driveway, I noticed a dark pickup parked across the street. Two men wearing plain work shirts were slowly photographing houses through partially lowered windows. When they reached my property, one of them pointed toward the roof while the other wrote something on a clipboard before both vehicles quietly drove away. No company logos. No neighborhood introductions. No explanation. The engine noise faded into the distance, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Looking back now, that ordinary afternoon was the last moment my house still looked exactly the way my father had left it, and I had no idea that someone else had already begun treating my home like the next phase of a carefully planned project instead of a place where a family lived. The morning after I noticed those unfamiliar trucks, I drove straight to the county records office carrying a binder that had become thicker every week. Inside were every violation notice, every certified letter, every photograph, and every email I had exchanged with the association. The clerk behind the counter recognized the neighborhood the moment I mentioned Willow Creek Estates. She did not say anything unusual, but there was a pause just long enough to tell me she had heard that name before. I requested every publicly available permit connected to the community improvement project and every contractor registration associated with the board's proposed construction plans. Most of the documents arrived within minutes. Others, strangely, showed no permit activity at all despite millions of dollars of planned work. That alone did not prove misconduct, but it added another piece to a puzzle that refused to fit together. Back home, I spread the paperwork across my dining room table beside engineering drawings from previous projects. The smell of black coffee mixed with fresh printer ink, while afternoon sunlight reflected across pages filled with signatures, dates, and invoice numbers. One contractor appeared repeatedly under different project categories, yet each payment authorization carried a slightly different mailing address. Another company listed as providing consulting services shared the same registered office as a property management firm working for the board. Individually, those details could have been harmless. Together, they suggested relationships that deserved a closer look. I submitted another written request asking for competitive bid documentation and conflict of interest disclosures. The response arrived 2 days later. My request had been denied because the information was considered privileged under internal association policy. Internal policy. Those two words stayed in my head all evening because policies cannot erase state disclosure requirements. Someone was counting on homeowners accepting the answer without checking the law. I was not one of those homeowners. That weekend, I climbed onto the roof for another inspection just before sunset. A cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood, while lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically from yard to yard. Everything looked ordinary until I reached the rear slope overlooking the alley. Several shingles near one ridge line had tiny chalk markings that definitely had not been there during my previous inspection. They were small blue circles no larger than a quarter, spaced almost evenly across the roof. Contractors sometimes use chalk during inspections, but no inspection had been scheduled, and nobody had requested permission to access my property. I photographed every mark before climbing down. As I packed away my ladder, I noticed fresh tire tracks pressed into the gravel behind my fence. They had not been there the previous evening because heavy dew would have softened the surface overnight. Whoever had entered the alley had done so recently. Later that night, my security camera recorded headlights slowing behind the house shortly after midnight. The vehicle never stopped long enough for the license plate to become visible. It rolled forward, paused for several seconds beside my property, then disappeared into the darkness without another sound. Most people would have dismissed it as a delivery driver or someone taking a wrong turn. I could not. Too many small details had begun pointing in the same direction. The blue chalk marks, the anonymous trucks, the missing permits, the denied records, the unexplained late-night visitor. None of them proved what was coming, but together they formed the unmistakable outline of a plan that had already been set into motion long before the first piece of my roof ever disappeared. Monday arrived with clear skies, cool air, and the kind of quiet morning that usually makes people believe everything is under control. I left early for a routine structural inspection at a school renovation project nearly 60 miles away, locking my front door just after 7 o'clock as the scent of fresh coffee still lingered inside the kitchen. Before backing out of the driveway, I glanced toward the roof almost out of habit. The blue chalk circles were still there, untouched, waiting like unanswered questions. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from one of my exterior cameras. I opened the live feed expecting to see a delivery driver. Instead, a large white box truck had stopped in front of my house. The company name printed on its side had been covered with magnetic panels, leaving nothing but a generic phone number. For workers wearing matching safety vests stepped onto my property carrying ladders, roofing tools, and stacks of protective tarps. My stomach tightened immediately. I called the number listed on the truck. It was disconnected. I called the property management office. No answer. Then I called Diane Holloway. She picked up after the second ring with surprising calm. She told me there had been an emergency structural concern reported by an independent contractor and assured me the association was simply protecting community safety. I asked who had authorized anyone to enter my property. She avoided the question completely and suggested we discuss everything after the work had been completed. I drove back as quickly as traffic allowed, but by the time I reached Willow Creek Estates nearly 3 hours later, the damage had already been done. The first thing I noticed was silence. No power tools. No workers. Just pieces of roofing material neatly stacked beside my driveway, as though someone had finished a scheduled renovation. My heart sank when I looked up. Entire sections of the roof above my living room were gone, exposing clean lines of roof decking and open rafters beneath the afternoon sky. There were no broken shingles scattered across the lawn, no fallen tree limbs, no signs of storm damage. Everything looked strangely organized, almost surgical. The cuts followed perfectly straight lines that no tornado, hailstorm, or wind event could ever produce. I climbed the ladder without thinking twice. Years of engineering experience immediately told me something was terribly wrong. The nail patterns had been removed in sequence instead of ripped apart. Flashing pieces had been lifted carefully without bending. Even the underlayment had been rolled back instead of torn. Whoever did this knew exactly how to dismantle a roof while making it appear that replacement work had already begun. Then I saw it. One bright stainless steel roofing nail wedged between two rafters. Every other fastener on my house had been galvanized steel because that was what my father installed during the last re-roofing project. Stainless steel did not belong there. I slipped it into a small evidence bag from my work truck almost automatically. It was a tiny piece of metal weighing almost nothing, yet something about it refused to leave my mind. That single nail did not match the house, the construction records, or the original materials. Standing beneath an open sky inside what had been my living room only hours earlier, I realized the smallest object on that roof might become the biggest mistake anyone involved had made. Sleep became almost impossible after that afternoon. Every creak of the exposed rafters sounded louder without a roof to soften the night air, and every weather forecast felt personal. I covered the open sections with temporary tarps before sunset, securing them exactly the way emergency response crews do after severe storms. By morning, condensation had gathered beneath the plastic, but the interior remained dry enough to preserve the evidence. I photographed everything again under natural daylight, measuring every opening with a laser distance meter and recording precise dimensions in a field notebook that I had carried on construction sites for years. The numbers told a story that words could not. Every removed section followed standard material lengths used by professional roofing crews. The spacing between removed panels remained remarkably consistent. Even the fastener extraction pattern matched commercial installation procedures rather than storm damage. Whoever had worked on my house knew exactly where every structural member was located before lifting the first shingle. Instead of arguing with the board, I decided to let the evidence speak first. I requested a complete activity log from my home security system and discovered that one camera facing the alley had briefly lost its wireless connection during the exact period the truck arrived. At first, that seemed like terrible luck until I remembered installing a separate backup recorder months earlier inside the garage. Unlike the cloud service, that recorder stored raw footage locally whenever the internet connection dropped. I connected the hard drive to my laptop, and within minutes the missing timeline appeared. The image quality was not perfect, but it clearly showed the white truck entering the alley almost 40 minutes before anyone approached the front of the house. One worker stepped out carrying a clipboard while another pointed directly toward the blue chalk circles I had photographed days earlier. They were not inspecting the roof. They were following marks that had already been placed there. I copied the footage onto multiple encrypted drives before making another discovery. The truck paused long enough for sunlight to reflect off the rear license plate. After enhancing several frames, enough characters became visible to narrow the registration search. A former colleague now working as a forensic building consultant agreed to review the footage without charge after hearing what had happened. Less than 24 hours later, he called me back. The truck, according to commercial fleet records, had previously been assigned to a subcontractor that had completed maintenance work for Willow Creek Estates on several occasions. That alone was not proof of wrongdoing, but it connected another thread. Then I examined the stainless steel nail under magnification. Tiny manufacturing marks identified it as part of a premium fastener system used by only a handful of regional roofing suppliers because it was significantly more expensive than standard galvanized products. My father had never purchased those materials, and neither had I. Curious, I contacted the supplier listed in the product catalog. The representative could not disclose customer invoices, but he confirmed one important detail. Their stainless steel roofing systems had recently been delivered in bulk to a contractor whose name sounded strangely familiar. It matched one of the companies repeatedly appearing throughout the association's financial records. I leaned back in my chair, listening to rain begin tapping softly against the temporary tarp overhead. For the first time since this ordeal began, the scattered pieces no longer looked random. The chalk marks, the anonymous truck, the disconnected phone number, the hidden video, the premium nail, and the contractor connected to the board were no longer separate clues. They were becoming one continuous trail, and every new fact pointed toward the same destination. 3 days later, my attorney filed a formal preservation notice demanding that the association, its management company, and every contractor connected to the project retain all emails, invoices, phone records, photographs, work schedules, and internal communications related to my property. The response arrived faster than any violation notice ever had. Diane Holloway's attorney dismissed my claims as speculation and insisted the board had acted responsibly after receiving an anonymous report describing an immediate safety concern. Anonymous. That single word immediately stood out because every emergency action I had reviewed during my engineering career required a documented inspection, an identified reporting party, and written authorization. Anonymous complaints might trigger an inspection. They did not authorize dismantling portions of a private residence. Instead of arguing, we requested sworn testimony from the subcontractor whose truck appeared in my security footage. I expected weeks of delays. Instead, something unexpected happened. The subcontractor's insurance carrier assigned its own investigator after learning that work may have occurred without proper written authorization. Insurance companies have little patience for undocumented liability, and they ask questions that nobody else thinks to ask. During that review, one project supervisor admitted his crew had never inspected my roof for storm damage before arriving. They had received a digital work order already marked as approved. More importantly, the attached photographs showing severe structural deterioration did not match my house. Even the chimney was different. My attorney quietly slid enlarged copies of my own photographs across the conference table. The supervisor stared at them for several seconds before taking a deep breath. He finally admitted the blue chalk circles had already been on the roof before his crew arrived because another inspection team had marked the removal locations several days earlier. That statement changed everything. The board could no longer claim they were reacting to an emergency because planning marks had existed well before the supposed safety concern appeared. We obtained the electronic work order through discovery, and hidden within its metadata sat another surprise. The approval had been uploaded from a laptop assigned to the Association Management Office nearly 48 hours before the anonymous complaint was officially logged. Timestamps do not care about excuses. Computers remember everything. Then another witness came forward completely on his own. A retired homeowner named Harold Benson contacted my attorney after recognizing the contractor's truck from local news coverage about the investigation. Harold lived near the alley behind my property and mentioned seeing workers measuring my roof almost a week before any emergency notice had been issued. He assumed they had my permission because they looked organized and carried professional equipment. He even remembered Diane's white sport utility vehicle parked nearby, while two men reviewed printed diagrams across its hood. Suddenly, every isolated detail locked together with almost mechanical precision. The chalk marks identified removal points. The inspection photographs belonged to another property. The work order had been approved before any complaint existed. The contractor followed instructions that had already been prepared. The insurance investigator documented missing authorization. Harold independently confirmed planning activity days earlier. By the end of that week, my attorney stopped referring to the situation as a property dispute. He looked across his conference table, tapped the growing stack of evidence with one finger, and said quietly, "Ethan, this no longer looks like a misunderstanding. It looks like a coordinated scheme." For the first time since I had stood beneath an open sky inside my own living room, I realized I was no longer trying to prove what happened. I was simply organizing the order in which everyone else was about to learn the truth. The hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning inside the county civil courthouse, a building that smelled faintly of polished wood, old paper, and fresh coffee from the lobby downstairs. Diane Holloway arrived surrounded by attorneys and every remaining board member, each carrying thick binders meant to project confidence. They barely glanced in my direction. From where they sat, this was supposed to be another routine dispute with an uncooperative homeowner. They still believed paperwork could overpower facts. My attorney quietly placed one banker box after another on our table. Inside were photographs, engineering measurements, metadata reports, security footage, supplier records, contractor statements, inspection timelines, and financial documents that had taken months to assemble. Nothing dramatic happened when the hearing began. That was the remarkable thing about real evidence. It never needed theatrics. It simply waited its turn. The association's attorney argued first, repeating that emergency action had been necessary to protect community safety and prevent additional structural deterioration. Then the judge asked a simple question. Where is the original inspection report that justified immediate intervention? The courtroom became noticeably quieter. A document was produced, but my attorney requested permission to display the digital metadata already admitted into evidence. The timestamps appeared on the courtroom screen. According to the file history, the inspection report had been created after the work order authorizing roof removal had already been approved. The timeline could not exist as presented. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Next came the security footage from my backup recorder. It showed workers arriving with predetermined markings already visible across the roof days before any reported emergency. The subcontractor's sworn testimony confirmed that his crew had followed those markings rather than conducting an independent evaluation. Then the supplier representative testified remotely, identifying the premium stainless steel fasteners delivered to the contractor connected with the association's approved vendor list. Finally, Harold Benson described seeing planning activity nearly a week before the official complaint existed. Each witness added another precise piece until the entire picture stood on its own. The judge never raised his voice. He simply kept turning pages, comparing dates, signatures, invoices, and electronic records. At one point, he removed his glasses, looked directly toward the board, and asked why an emergency authorization referenced photographs from an entirely different property. Nobody answered immediately. The explanation that eventually came sounded uncertain even to the people presenting it. Outside the courtroom, the consequences spread faster than anyone expected. The association's insurance carrier immediately reserved its rights under the liability policy, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. Several contractors withdrew from pending community projects. Mortgage lenders financing the clubhouse expansion suspended funding after learning that litigation now questioned the integrity of board approvals. Homeowners who had quietly paid the assessment began contacting independent attorneys of their own. Within days, resignation letters started appearing. One board member stepped down citing personal reasons. Another announced retirement from community service. Diane remained in office for only a short time longer before the remaining directors voted to remove her during a special meeting attended by more residents than any gathering in the neighborhood's history. Standing outside the courthouse that afternoon, I listened as church bells echoed from somewhere across downtown, while a cool breeze carried away the last storm clouds. Months earlier, they believed they could pressure one homeowner into surrendering through fear and paperwork. Instead, every document they created had become another witness against them, and the foundation beneath their authority had collapsed not because anyone shouted louder, but because the truth had finally been organized in the exact order it deserved to be seen. 6 months later, the neighborhood looked almost the same from the outside, yet everything that mattered had changed. My roof had been rebuilt using the original engineering specifications my father trusted years earlier, and every beam above my living room had been inspected, documented, and certified the proper way. When rain finally returned one autumn evening, I stood quietly beneath that familiar ceiling listening to water roll across new shingles instead of dripping onto hardwood floors. It was the most peaceful sound I had heard in a very long time. The legal cases continued long after the headlines disappeared, but facts have a way of traveling farther than rumors. The court approved financial judgments against multiple parties responsible for the coordinated misconduct, and several insurance carriers pursued reimbursement through their own civil actions. As those obligations accumulated, properties owned by former board members entered foreclosure proceedings or court-supervised sales after liens, legal expenses, and uncovered liabilities overwhelmed their finances. I never celebrated any family's hardship because that had never been my goal. My goal had always been accountability. Yet life has an unusual sense of symmetry. An investment company that regularly worked with my engineering firm notified me that several neighboring properties were scheduled for public auction. They believed the homes fit my long-term investment strategy because I already understood the area better than anyone evaluating the listings. I attended the auctions quietly without speaking to reporters or former residents. There were no dramatic speeches, no victory laps, and no angry confrontations. I simply reviewed inspection reports, calculated repair costs, and submitted bids based on market value. One after another, the properties transferred through completely legal public sales. By the end of the process, I had acquired every home that had once belonged to the board members who spent months trying to force me out of mine. The irony was impossible to ignore, but the paperwork never cared about irony. It only cared about signatures, deadlines, and lawful ownership. Instead of leaving the houses vacant, I renovated each one carefully using local contractors and transparent bidding practices. Several were sold to young families purchasing their first homes. Others became long-term rentals managed under straightforward leases with no hidden surprises. The extravagant clubhouse expansion was permanently canceled, and the association adopted sweeping governance reforms requiring open financial records, independent competitive bidding, and homeowner oversight committees before any major assessment could ever be proposed again. Harold Benson still waved every morning from his front porch. The elderly couple who had feared losing their retirement home eventually recovered much of what they had paid through settlement funds approved by the court. Even neighbors who had once avoided eye contact gradually began stopping to talk again. One afternoon, a little boy riding his bicycle pointed toward my house and asked his father why the roof looked newer than everyone else's. His father smiled and answered, "Because someone cared enough to rebuild it the right way." I could not have said it better myself. Sometimes people believe justice arrives with flashing lights or dramatic courtroom speeches. My experience taught me something different. Justice often arrives as a quiet stack of documents, a carefully preserved photograph, a forgotten video file, a single stainless steel nail that never belonged, and the patience to let every small fact find its proper place. They believed removing part of my home would pressure me into surrendering everything else. Instead, every decision they made became another brick in the foundation of their own downfall. My father once told me that the strongest structures are not built by rushing the work. They are built one solid piece at a time until nothing dishonest can shake them. Standing beneath the roof we rebuilt together in memory, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Truth does not need to shout. It only needs enough time to become impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching this story. If Ethan Walker's patience, professional integrity, and determination to let the evidence speak louder than intimidation inspired you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy powerful legal dramas and true stories where careful preparation overcomes abuse of power, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable HOA conflicts, property rights battles, and real-life justice stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story about hidden evidence, overlooked details, and ordinary people who quietly stand their ground when everyone else expects them to give up. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to life, and we cannot wait to share the next one with you. That if you were in Ethan Walker's position, would you have focused on repairing your home immediately, or would you have gathered every piece of evidence before taking legal action? Tell us your choice in the comments and explain why.